This is Midweek Bible Study with Pastor Alan Deuce.
Welcome back to Midweek Bible Study. Listen to this quote. The young people of today are utterly dissolute and disorderly. That's from Martin Luther in the 16th century. The youth are rebellious, pleasure-seeking, and irresponsible. They have no respect for their elders, said Plato in 400 BC. The philosopher Socrates complained, children now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for elders and love chatter. Chatter, I love that word, don't you? How about this one? On a 6,000-year-old Egyptian tomb, there is this inscription. We live in a decadent age. Young people no longer respect their parents. They are rude and impatient. They inhabit taverns and have no self-control. Elaine Monk shared those quotes on a Wednesday evening a couple of years ago, but then she switched immediately and shared that some of our favorite hymns were actually written by younger adults. Isaac Watts wrote, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, before he was 19 years old. My Jesus, I Love You was written by a 16-year-old. And then Elaine went on to name several others. And then I started thinking about biblical characters, and the one that jumped out to me immediately was Mary, who was 16 or less probably when she became the mother of Jesus. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12, Paul said to Timothy, Don't let anyone look down on you because you're young, but set an example. Say that part again. Set an example for the believers in speech and conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. John Maxwell said something that got my attention years ago. He said, if you've been the leader of an organization for 3 years or more, any problem in that organization is your fault. Ouch. Now, we might argue with John about his time frame, but most of us would agree that leaders are responsible to model and to teach right words, right thoughts, right actions. Leaders, Paul says, and everyone else does as well, leaders set the pace for the church. We need godly men and women of every generation. We need godly men and women to step up and to lead, and in these days to serve in the church. Paul's letter to Timothy up to this point has been focused clearly on the truth. He says in the early part of the letter, false teaching must be rejected and truth must be clarified. Then he says church leaders must be reminded to live holy lives. Then he says everyone, all of us, and I would certainly agree with this, all of us need to be encouraged. Now Paul reminds us that people and relationships matter, and like he usually does, he starts with some general statements and then he dives in and digs into some very specific guidance regarding different groups of people. And he begins by saying to Timothy, exhort older men respectfully. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 1 says, Do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he were your father. Now there's several dimensions of this verse that really have captured my attention, but the most fascinating part of this verse is that Paul assumes that Timothy will be challenging older men in the church to change. Challenging people to change. That is the simple meaning of that word, exhort. I know we don't use that word very often. Last night when I shared this lesson face-to-face with our people here at Richfield, and I asked one of them to define exhort, no one in the room could come up with a simple definition. We don't use that word a lot, but here's what it means. Challenging someone to change. Paul doesn't say, Timothy, don't exhort older people. No, he assumes that Timothy is going to be exhorting older men. He says, do it respectfully. In my experience, one of the most difficult things to do is to challenge anyone to change. No one wants to be told that they're doing something wrong or incorrectly and that they need to change. I mean, come on, telling your boss that he or she is wrong is often a way to become unemployed, right? Remember that in Paul's day, older people were treated with incredible utmost respect. Now, in our culture, in our day and time, we don't experience that. We don't feel that. We don't understand that. We celebrate youth and beauty, and as people age, we tend to often regard them less. You know, they don't understand technology, and they don't understand all of the things that are happening in the modern world, and as a result of that, we have a tendency often to regard them with less respect. Paul says, no, absolutely not. Timothy, Christian, treat, honor, bless older people, respect them, give them that honor, but exhort them nonetheless. For Timothy, as a young man, to tell an older man that he is wrong would probably be considered insulting. Paul says, do it anyway. Paul has spent the last several chapters here in this letter telling Timothy to correct theological errors and to challenge Christian leaders to live real holy lives. These are the people, these are the older leaders that Timothy is called on to challenge. That's hard. But Paul says, treat these older men with the same consideration. Look at this. Treat them with the same consideration that you would if you were speaking to your own father. I talked to a man recently who is helping care for his aging father. This man is in his early 50s and helping care for his aging father. And his father is not making wise choices often. And yet his son loves him desperately and wants so much to help him. And it's created all kinds of tension in the relationship. And he continues to just love and engage and care because he loves his dad so much. Paul says, this is how we approach an older man, as if we were speaking to our own fathers. I love my dad. I respect my dad a lot. He isn't perfect, but it takes an enormous amount of emotional energy for me to ever consider correcting anything that my father does or says. Yet, respectful correction is what Paul requires Timothy to accomplish. This is the relationship with Timothy and older men. And then he says, and treat your peers like brothers that you love. On into verse 1. Treat younger men as brothers. Now, I tacked on there, like you love, to clarify, because that's really what Paul means. And I know that in many of our family relationships, we love our brothers intensely, but sometimes we don't recognize that that is a part of what the Apostle Paul is assuming that is being conveyed here. We treat our peers, those who are in our own age group, stage in life kind of group, like brothers that we love. I don't like trying to correct anyone, honestly, because in my experience, it almost never goes well. When I grew up, I had an older brother, and he was always trying to tell me what to do. And I was a kid, and I did not respond well. You know, you try to tell, as a parent, you try to tell a child what to do, and what are they going to do? They're not going to be happy with you. They're going to get mad. You tell a spouse, you know, that what they're doing needs to be corrected, and it usually is going to be a long conversation. Other people get angry. People leave churches when someone tries to correct them. My brother would work so hard at trying to correct me positively. He really cared about me, and I look back at that as an adult through that lens, looking at us as younger people. And even when he would do his best to communicate positively, I would still get upset. It wasn't rational. It didn't have to be. I didn't want him telling me what to do. I was a child. We expect children to behave that way. We hope adults will behave a little differently. Paul says, treat your peers like brothers you love. Keep trying. Keep caring. Don't keep letting them live their lives based on false doctrine. Don't let them keep destroying their lives through sinful behavior. And remember, in previous chapters, Paul has outlined false doctrine and sinful behaviors, and he has given us enormous, uncomfortable examples of both. He said, don't let them continue down that road. Care and love and correct them with love. Care enough That even when you know it may not go well, even when you know it may not be received as you hope and pray that it will be received, care enough to provide that correction anyway. Then he shifts to relationships with women. And he says, treat all women with purity. Verse 2, older women as mothers and younger women as sisters with absolute purity. Purity is not a really popular word these days. Our culture assumes that our sexuality is our own choice. Jan and I went to get our first COVID shot yesterday, and part of the questioning that they asked us was they asked us what gender we identified as. Of course, because American law says that I can choose today to be male or female. It also assumes that our sexual behavior is our own possession over which we are obligated to show almost no restraint. God says purity in relationships between men and women is the baseline on which we should build healthy relationships. And purity begins with respect. It includes treating older women with the respect your mother deserves and younger women like a sister that you treasure. When you look at that woman, older, and think of her as your mother, younger, your peer, you think of her, is this how I would want my sister to be treated? He says Christians live differently. Christian leaders particularly are expected to model the highest standards of moral purity, but this is true for all of us as followers of Jesus. When I was a child, being divorced disqualified you automatically from becoming a pastor in most conservative denominations. That changed very quickly because so many people across our society were becoming divorced. But the Bible still teaches that there is no such thing as two Christians who are living for Jesus getting divorced. Paul says, treat women with absolute purity, as mothers or as sisters. Then he shifts his focus to caring for the needy. Verse 3, he says, give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. Now, the word for proper recognition is the word that is used over in the fifth commandment, the Ten Commandments, the fifth of the Ten Commandments, which is about honoring our parents. It's that word, honoring. Give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. Proper recognition, honoring. We are to treat legitimately needy people with honor. Paul will go on to carefully qualify what really in need means. But he starts by how we treat other people. Paul was always concerned about helping the poor and the needy. He himself collected money from the churches where he traveled and started churches and led churches. And he collected money regularly and took it to Jerusalem to help the church there because the needs there were so acute. Our church does a lot for the needy, and I know many Christians do. Our country, thankfully, provides a lot for the needy. So I think in that context, it can be easy to overlook our responsibility to help, and also sometimes it can be easy to treat needy people with a little disrespect. Last night, after prayer meeting, someone was waiting for me in the lobby of our church. He had come in and he was asking for money, and several people came to me to let me know that he was there and waiting, and could I go talk with him about that situation. Most of them were very caring and treated him with the utmost respect. But at least one person said something to me that might have been misunderstood as something slightly disrespectful about this man and his situation. I don't know the details of this man's situation. I can only guess. I don't know whether he was being completely honest with me and with the church. I can only guess. But Paul challenges us to give proper recognition, to honor the legitimately needy. Our church tries to do that, and Paul is reminding a church in Ephesus that was already doing that particularly widows, people in that society who were right on the margins and had nothing, and they would be utterly without if someone didn't help them. He challenged them to take this responsibility very seriously. But the church also needs to focus on the legitimate needs first. Verse 4, he says families should care for the widows, the needy in their families first. If a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn first of all to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family and so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God. One of our Christian responsibilities is to care for our parents and our grandparents. Notice, he says, put their religion into practice. How do I put my faith in Jesus into practice? Paul says, by caring for the legitimate needs of my family members. We express our faith in Jesus by caring for the legitimately needy in our own families first. Now let me ask you, if you've experienced this, is it easy always to care for older parents and grandparents? Of course not. But it also isn't easy for older people to have to be dependent. I spoke with a lady in our church family about a year ago, and she had just had to surrender her driver's license to her children on her doctor's orders. And I know her pretty well, and I just asked her, what did that feel like? She said, Alan, do you remember how excited you were when you first got your driver's license and you got to take your parents' car and go out and go driving all by yourself? She said it feels just like that, only the opposite. It isn't easy for older people. It isn't easy to let other people manage your life and your circumstances. Sometimes this causes painful conversations and can be hard on relationships. So remember to honor your older parents and grandparents. It is an expression of our faith in Jesus. And he says, and this is pleasing to God. Two very strong statements in one verse here. This is an expression of how we follow Jesus, and this is pleasing to God. What is our priority as followers of Jesus? To be like Jesus. Jesus lived to please the Father. He went to the cross to please the Father. He goes on to say, now, we care for our family members, but the church must help the needy who are alone. Verse 5. The widow who is really in need and left all alone puts her hope in God. Puts her hope in God. And continues night and day to pray and to ask God for help. Now the people he's describing here are people who had nothing but Jesus to rely on. I remember when I graduated from high school, I received a beautiful handmade lamp from a little old couple who had attended our church. He was a retired pastor who had moved into our town while I was in high school, and he joined the church there that my family attended. I remember them. They were some of the sweetest, most godly people I had ever met. I also remember being startled that they moved into this little teeny, tiny, today tiny houses are popular, but this was not that kind of tiny house. It was so small. And I realized that they were living very, very, very frugally. And yet they were some of the most sincerely happy people I have ever known. They lived in utter dependence on God. They had very, very little materially, but they trusted Jesus. Now, I was a kid, so I have no idea what the church did to help them, although I believe that our church there would have helped them as much as they would allow, because I'm not sure they would have allowed the church to help them much. They would have said, oh no, give it to someone who really needs it more. But this verse makes me think about them. Paul said the church should help the needy who are absolutely alone. And of course, until pretty recently, there just weren't things like welfare or Social Security or other kinds of social organizations to help desperately needy people. Thankfully, our nation has been built on Christian principles of compassion that include providing generously for most of the legitimately needy. So one of the questions that always comes to me in this conversation is, will we end up helping people who are abusing the system? And my answer always is probably. I had a guy who came to me and therefore to our church right before the Christmas holidays, and several people really assessed his situation and just believed that he was completely legitimate, and so we helped him. We helped him more than we would have normally helped someone in that situation. And then throughout the Christmas holidays and through New Year's, I discovered that he probably was taking advantage of the church. But just because somebody takes advantage of the church, we can't stop helping, because the real needs are everywhere. The church must help the needy who are legitimately needy, and particularly those who are marginalized and alone. Now, we don't support self-destructive lifestyles. Verse 6, but the widow who lives for pleasure, the widow who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives. We as a church family right now are in the middle of collecting money for the Crisis Pregnancy Center because we believe in life. So we help young women with unplanned pregnancies and poor young mothers. But we have boundaries for how we help those who are living self-destructive lifestyles. We give away food constantly. We help pay utilities and rent sometimes. But we don't give cash almost ever because it's so easily abused and misused. We usually refer people to agencies that are able to determine the legitimacy of their needs. And still we know that we may help someone who isn't legitimately needy, and that's okay, because we want to care enough to help. But we want to help every legitimate need, and we define legitimate through a Christ-focused lens. Now, Paul goes on to say, very quickly, we must remind one another of these responsibilities. I know that today I'm not telling you anything new. I'm reminding you. But that's what the apostle is doing here for all of us. He says, give the people these instructions so that no one may be open to blame. I'm kind of amazed at how quickly I can forget so many things. It's also difficult to do some of these things that we've been talking about here tonight because our world is changing so rapidly. How should we as Christians, apply these teachings about helping the poor or the widows today? That was a straightforward question when Paul put it to Timothy, but with today's social systems, it can be a harder question. 30 years ago, when somebody was broken down beside the highway, many of us would stop to help them. Now, with cell phones, we almost never do. Our son had an accident recently, and he actually needed someone to stop and help, but no one did for several hours. And I probably wouldn't have, because I rarely do now, because things have changed. Yet these can be difficult questions. Jesus calls us to treat everyone with honor and respect while we keep trying to do what is right. Because remember, our faith demands that we take action. Verse 8, anyone who does not provide for their relatives and especially for their own household has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Now that is an extremely strong statement. If I don't care for the needy, especially those in my own family, I am worse than a non-Christian. Now, thankfully, most of the Christians I've known work extra hard caring for their parents and their families. But we all need reminders. Paul is reminding us to treat everyone better than they sometimes deserve. Yet we must continue to call each other to account, to remind one another, to love, to honor, to treat others better than they deserve, and to help in every way we can. Okay, let's pray together. God, thank you so much for how you've blessed us. Most of us, God, you've blessed materially beyond our needs. We're so grateful. And we pray, Lord, that you would continue to open our hearts and our minds to the truth of these verses and help us as we continue to try to apply the truth of these verses in everyday life. Bless us to bless others. In Jesus' strong name, amen. Well, God bless you. Thanks for joining me. Have a great week.